My name is Sophia Chen, and on my wedding day in front of 300 guests, my new mother-in-law stood up during the reception, clinked her champagne glass, and announced to the entire room that I was nothing more than a gold digger who had trapped her precious son with my calculated charm. 2 years later, when my technology company expanded into their struggling Rust Belt town, every single member of my husband's family submitted job applications to work for the woman they had, publicly humiliated. What happened next was not revenge, it was a masterclass in how character, competence, and quiet determination can transform the people who underestimate you into the people who depend on you. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The story that would eventually reshape an entire community began not in boardrooms or corner offices, but in a cramped studio apartment above a dry cleaner in Chinatown, where the smell of cleaning solvents mixed with the aroma of my grandmother's congee each morning. I was 24 years old, working as a junior software developer at a mid-sized technology firm, and spending every evening and weekend building the foundation for what would become one of the most successful fintech companies on the West Coast. My grandmother, Popo, had immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but a sewing machine and an unshakable belief that education and hard work could overcome any obstacle. She had raised my mother while cleaning offices at night and taking English classes during the day, eventually saving enough money to open a small alteration shop that became the heart of our family's financial stability. Popo never learned to use a computer, but she understood numbers within precision that would have impressed any Wall Street analyst. "Sophia," she would say in her mixture of Mandarin and heavily accented English, "money is not about what you spend. Money is about what you build. You build something that helps people, people will help you build more." Her words became the philosophical foundation for everything that followed. While my colleagues at the software company spent their evenings at happy hours and weekend brunches, I spent mine analyzing financial data patterns, studying market inefficiencies, and developing algorithms that could democratize access to investment opportunities that had previously been available only to wealthy individuals and institutional investors. The technology I was developing focused on micro-investing and automated financial planning for people who had been systematically excluded from traditional wealth-building opportunities. My algorithms could analyze spending patterns, identify opportunities for small-scale investments, and create diversified portfolios with as little as $5 in initial capital. The potential impact was staggering. Millions of people who had never been able to participate in stock markets or investment opportunities could begin building wealth through spare change and small monthly contributions. I worked 16-hour days during this period, sustained by Popo's congee, endless cups of jasmine tea, and the kind of focused determination that comes from believing you are building something that matters. My studio apartment became a miniature research and development center, with 3 computer monitors, financial charts covering every wall, and stacks of printed research papers that reached from floor to ceiling. The breakthrough came during a particularly challenging week when I had been working on a persistent algorithm problem that had stumped me for months. Traditional investment platforms required minimum balances that excluded most working-class families, while existing micro-investing apps charged fees that negated the benefits for small-scale investors. I needed to create a system that could generate revenue through volume rather than individual account fees, making it profitable to serve millions of small investors rather than hundreds of wealthy ones. At 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, while analyzing transaction data from various financial institutions, I discovered a pattern that changed everything. By aggregating microtransactions across thousands of users and leveraging collective purchasing power, I could negotiate institutional-level investment rates for individual users while generating revenue through small percentage-based fees that were virtually invisible to individual investors but substantial when multiplied across large user bases. The implications were revolutionary. Working families could build investment portfolios with the same advantages previously available only to millionaires, while my platform could become profitable by serving the vast middle and working class, markets that traditional financial institutions had ignored. I had discovered a way to democratize wealth building while creating a sustainable business model that aligned my success with my users' financial progress. I spent the following months developing a comprehensive business plan, creating detailed financial projections, and building a prototype platform that demonstrated the viability of my approach. My savings account dwindled as I invested everything into software development, legal consultations, and the preliminary infrastructure necessary to launch a financial technology company. Popo watched my bank balance shrink with concern, but never questioned my commitment to the project. "You are building something important," she would say when I expressed frustration about the financial strain. "Important things take time. Important things take sacrifice. You are strong enough for both." The validation I needed came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a professor of financial economics at Stanford who had been studying wealth inequality and access to investment opportunities, discovered my research through an academic paper I had submitted to a fintech conference. She reached out to discuss my approach and invited me to present my findings at a symposium focused on innovative solutions to economic inequality. My presentation at Stanford marked the first time I had shared my work with an audience of established financial experts, academic researchers, and potential investors. I was nervous but thoroughly prepared, having spent weeks refining my presentation materials and anticipating questions about methodology, scalability, and regulatory compliance. The response exceeded my most optimistic expectations. Dr. Morrison described my approach as revolutionary in its simplicity and profound in its potential impact. Several attendees approached me after the presentation with offers to discuss funding opportunities, partnership possibilities, and advisory relationships. Most importantly, I received validation that my work addressed a genuine market need and could create meaningful change in how ordinary people access wealth-building opportunities. Among the attendees that day was David Hartwell, who would eventually become my husband, and whose family would later provide the greatest test of my resolve and character. David was working as a financial analyst for a venture capital firm, conducting research on emerging fintech companies for potential investment opportunities. He approached me after my presentation with detailed questions about my business model, technical infrastructure, and plans for regulatory compliance. Our initial conversation lasted 3 hours, extending from the symposium venue to a nearby coffee shop where we discussed everything from algorithm development to the philosophical implications of democratizing financial markets. David demonstrated genuine understanding of both the technical complexity and social significance of my work, asking thoughtful questions that revealed his deep knowledge of financial markets and his appreciation for innovative approaches to persistent problems. What impressed me most about David was his recognition that my work represented more than just another technology startup. He understood that I was attempting to address systemic inequalities that had prevented millions of people from participating in wealth-building opportunities, and he seemed genuinely excited about the potential for creating positive social impact while building a profitable business. Our professional discussions gradually evolved into personal conversations as we discovered shared values about the role of business in creating social progress, the importance of financial education, and the potential for technology to solve problems that had previously seemed intractable. David came from a very different background than mine. His father owned a small manufacturing company in Ohio. His mother had worked as a high school English teacher, and his family represented the kind of middle-class stability that I had always admired but never experienced. Over the following months, our relationship deepened as David became not just a romantic partner, but also a trusted advisor who helped me navigate the complex world of venture capital, regulatory requirements, and business development. His experience in financial analysis complemented my technical expertise, and his connections within the investment community provided access to funding opportunities that would have been difficult for me to identify independently. The first major funding milestone came 8 months after the Stanford presentation, when David's firm decided to lead a seed funding round that provided the capital necessary to transform my prototype into a fully functional platform. The investment allowed me to hire a small team of developers, comply with financial regulations, and begin the user acquisition process that would determine whether my theoretical models could succeed in practical application. Launch day arrived on a crisp October morning, exactly 18 months after I had achieved my initial algorithmic breakthrough. The platform went live at 6 a.m. Pacific Time, and I spent the entire day monitoring user registrations, transaction volumes, and system performance from my apartment, which had been transformed into a temporary mission control center. The response exceeded every projection I had developed. Within 24 hours, 3,000 users had created accounts and initiated their first investments. Within 1 week, we had processed over 50,000 microtransactions and generated more investment activity than most traditional financial advisors handle in an entire month. Within 1 month, user growth required expanding our technical infrastructure and hiring additional customer service representatives to handle inquiries from people who had never previously owned any investment assets. The success was validating, but also overwhelming. Media outlets began requesting interviews about the democratization of investment opportunities. Financial industry publications wrote articles analyzing our business model and predicting the impact on traditional wealth management companies. Most importantly, we began receiving testimonials from users whose lives were being changed through access to investment opportunities that had previously been unavailable to them. Sarah Martinez, a single mother from Phoenix, wrote to tell us that our platform had allowed her to begin building a college fund for her daughter through her coffee shop tips and spare change. Robert Kim, a construction worker from Seattle, shared that he had generated enough investment returns to make a down payment on his first home. These stories reminded me daily that our work was creating genuine impact in people's lives, transforming financial stress into financial opportunity for families who had never believed such transformation was possible. As the company grew, David and I decided to formalize our personal relationship alongside our professional partnership. His proposal came during a quiet evening in my apartment, surrounded by the financial charts and technical diagrams that had become the backdrop for our entire courtship. He understood that marrying me meant joining a life dedicated to building something larger than ourselves, and I appreciated his willingness to embrace both the excitement and uncertainty that comes with entrepreneurial ambition. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Planning our wedding became an exercise in balancing my family's modest traditions with David's family's expectations for a celebration that would reflect what they considered appropriate for their son's marriage. My mother and Popo were excited about the wedding, but concerned about the expense and complexity of hosting an event that would satisfy David's family's social expectations. David's parents, whom I had met only briefly during 2 previous visits to Ohio, seemed pleasant but somewhat reserved in their interactions with me. The first indication that David's family harbored concerns about our relationship came during a phone conversation between David and his mother, which I overheard while preparing dinner in our shared apartment. His mother, Patricia, was expressing worry about the pace of our relationship and questioning whether I truly understood the responsibilities that came with marrying into their family. "She seems very focused on her work," Patricia said, her voice carrying clearly through the phone. "Are you certain she understands what marriage means? Building a family requires compromise and dedication to something beyond personal ambition." David defended me firmly, explaining that my dedication to building the company reflected exactly the kind of commitment and work ethic that would make me an excellent partner. He described my background, my grandmother's influence, and the values that had shaped my approach to both business and relationships. His support was unwavering and comprehensive, but I could hear the tension in his voice as he navigated between loyalty to me and respect for his parents' concerns. That conversation marked the beginning of my awareness that David's family viewed our relationship through a lens that I had not previously considered. To them, my professional success and financial independence represented not strength and compatibility, but rather potential threats to traditional family dynamics and gender roles that they believed should define a successful marriage. The wedding planning process revealed additional layers of complexity, as David's family became increasingly involved in decisions about venue, guest list, catering, and ceremony details. Patricia and David's father, William, had strong opinions about what constituted an appropriate celebration, and their suggestions consistently emphasized expense and ostentation in ways that made me uncomfortable. "We want to make sure this wedding reflects the kind of family David is joining," Patricia explained during one particularly tense planning meeting. "Our community will be watching, and we need to demonstrate that he has chosen well." I interpreted her emphasis on chosen well as concern about my ability to host an event that would meet their social expectations, and I committed considerable time and resources to ensuring that our wedding would exceed any reasonable standard for elegance and sophistication. I hired a professional wedding planner, selected a venue that could accommodate 300 guests, and invested in every detail from floral arrangements to entertainment that would create the kind of celebration that David's family would be proud to attend. What I did not understand was that no amount of elegant planning or expensive details would address their fundamental concern about my motivations for marrying their son. In their minds, my financial success had transformed me from a suitable partner into a potential threat, someone whose independence and ambition might disrupt the family dynamics they had spent decades establishing. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather and flawless execution of every planned detail. The ceremony was beautiful, the venue was stunning, and our guests seemed genuinely moved by the celebration of our commitment to each other. David and I exchanged vows that reflected our shared vision for building a life dedicated to both personal happiness and meaningful contribution to others. But as the reception began and champagne began to flow, Patricia's carefully maintained facade of approval began to crack. Her comments about the expense of the venue, the extravagance of the catering, and the unnecessary details that I had insisted upon revealed her growing resentment about what she interpreted as my display of financial power over her son. The moment that would define everything that followed came during the traditional speeches. When Patricia rose from her seat at the head table, champagne glass in hand, and requested the microphone from our wedding coordinator. What she said next would transform our wedding day from a celebration into a public humiliation that would motivate everything I accomplished in the years that followed. But that moment, and the reaction it provoked, deserves its own chapter in this story. Because sometimes the most important transformations begin with the most devastating revelations about who people really are when they believe you have no power to hold them accountable for their actions. The foundation had been laid. The success had been achieved. The relationship had been formalized. Now came the test that would determine whether I had the strength to maintain my dignity when people I was supposed to love and respect revealed that they had never seen me as anything more than a threat to be contained or a fortune to be captured. That test would begin with a champagne glass and a microphone, and it would end with 3 job applications and a lesson about the difference between respect that is given and respect that is earned. The Riverside Country Club had been transformed into an elegant celebration of love and commitment, with white silk draping the ceiling, crystal chandeliers casting warm light across tables adorned with white orchids and gold accents, and a string quartet providing sophisticated background music as 300 guests enjoyed what everyone agreed was one of the most beautiful wedding receptions they had ever attended. I had spent 8 months planning every detail, working with vendors to create an atmosphere that would honor both my family's values and David's family's expectations, ensuring that our wedding would be remembered as a celebration worthy of the love and respect we felt for each other. The evening had proceeded flawlessly through the cocktail hour, the dinner service, and the initial round of traditional toasts. David's best man had delivered a humorous speech about their college friendship. My maid of honor had shared touching stories about our bond since graduate school, and my father had offered heartfelt words about welcoming David into our family with gratitude and joy. The atmosphere was warm, celebratory, and filled with the kind of genuine happiness that comes from witnessing two people commit to building a meaningful life together. Patricia Hartwell had been seated at the head table throughout the evening, smiling appropriately during speeches, engaging in polite conversation with other family members, and maintaining the kind of gracious demeanor that experienced hostesses deploy at significant social events. She had complimented the floral arrangements, praised the quality of the dinner service, and expressed appreciation for the thoughtfulness that had gone into creating such a sophisticated celebration. Nothing in her behavior suggested the devastation that was about to unfold. The transition from celebration to humiliation began when Patricia rose from her seat during the natural lull that follows the conclusion of formal toasts. She moved with confidence and purpose, her champagne glass held elegantly in her left hand, while she gestured toward our wedding coordinator with her right, indicating her desire to address the assembled guests. The coordinator, assuming this was another planned family toast, handed Patricia the microphone with a professional smile, and stepped back to allow her center stage. The room quieted gradually as guests noticed Patricia's presence at the microphone. Conversations faded, silverware stopped clinking against plates, and attention focused toward the head table where she stood with the kind of authoritative presence that suggested important words were about to be shared. David looked toward his mother with mild curiosity, assuming she had prepared remarks that she had not previously mentioned. I felt a moment of surprise since we had not discussed additional family speeches, but I maintained my composure and prepared to listen to what I assumed would be traditional maternal advice about marriage and family happiness. Patricia began, with words that seemed conventional and appropriate for the occasion. She thanked the guests for celebrating with our families, complimented the beauty of the venue and the elegance of the evening, and expressed gratitude for the opportunity to welcome new family members into their lives. Her tone was warm and her delivery was polished, suggesting years of experience speaking at similar social gatherings. The audience listened attentively, expecting the kind of heartfelt maternal wisdom that often highlights wedding celebrations. But as Patricia continued speaking, her words began to take on a different character. She spoke about the importance of understanding true motivations in marriage, about the difference between genuine love and calculated attraction, and about the responsibility that families have to protect their members from relationships that might not be based on authentic emotional connection. Her tone remained pleasant and her smile never wavered, but the content of her speech began to create an uncomfortable tension throughout the room. The devastating blow came when Patricia raised her champagne glass and looked directly at me while addressing the 300 assembled guests. "To my new daughter-in-law," she said with perfect diction and unwavering eye contact, "who has shown us all that persistence and strategic thinking can indeed lead to significant financial security. While some might call it opportunistic, I prefer to think of it as entrepreneurial. After all, not every gold digger has the vision to build her own mine while she searches for treasure." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe as the full impact of Patricia's words settled over the room like a toxic cloud. The string quartet stopped playing mid-phrase. Servers froze in position with trays suspended in their hands, and guests stared with the kind of horrified fascination that accompanies public disasters. The only sound was the faint hum of air conditioning and the distant noise of traffic from the road beyond the country club grounds. I remained seated, my hands folded carefully in my lap, my expression neutral despite the heat that was rising in my cheeks and the pounding of my heart that seemed loud enough for the entire room to hear. I had been trained by Popo to maintain dignity in all circumstances, to never allow others to see weakness or vulnerability that could be exploited later, and to respond to attacks with grace rather than emotion. I drew upon that training now, keeping my breathing steady and my posture erect while my mind processed what had just occurred. David's reaction was immediate and explosive. He stood so quickly that his chair fell backward, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment as he reached for the microphone that his mother still held. "That is completely inappropriate and absolutely untrue," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, his voice shaking with fury. "Sophia has achieved everything through her own hard work and talent. She built her company from nothing, and she chose to marry me despite having more financial security than our entire family combined." Patricia maintained her composure, even as her son confronted her publicly, her smile never faltering as she replied in the same conversational tone she had used throughout her speech. "Of course, dear. I am sure she has many admirable qualities. I was simply acknowledging her impressive ability to identify valuable opportunities." She handed him the microphone with the kind of maternal patience typically reserved for correcting small children, then returned to her seat as if nothing unusual had occurred. The guests began to stir uncomfortably, unsure whether to applaud, respond, or simply pretend that the exchange had not happened. Some looked toward David and me with expressions of sympathy and support, while others studied their plates or suddenly found their champagne glasses fascinating. The wedding coordinator approached our table with obvious distress, clearly uncertain about how to restore normal celebration atmosphere after such an unprecedented breach of wedding etiquette. I stood slowly and deliberately, smoothing my dress, and taking a moment to make eye contact with as many guests as possible before speaking. When I finally addressed the room, my voice was clear, steady, and loud enough to reach every corner of the venue without requiring amplification. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate David and me," I said with genuine warmth. "Your presence means everything to us, and we are grateful for your love and support as we begin our marriage." I paused briefly, allowing my words to establish a sense of normalcy and grace that contrasted sharply with the ugliness that had preceded them. David and I have built our relationship on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine love for each other. We are excited about creating a life together that honors both of our families while pursuing our own dreams and goals. Tonight is about celebrating that commitment, and I hope you will continue to enjoy this beautiful evening with us. The response was immediate and supportive. Guests began applauding, first tentatively and then with genuine enthusiasm as they recognized my dignified handling of an impossible situation. Several people stood to join the applause, creating a wave of support that gradually encompassed the entire room. The string quartet resumed playing, servers continued their duties, and conversations slowly restarted as people processed what they had witnessed and decided how to respond. David took my hand and squeezed it gently, his eyes filled with admiration for how I had handled his mother's attack. He leaned close to whisper, "I am so sorry. That was inexcusable, and I will never let anything like that happen again." I squeezed his hand in return, grateful for his immediate and unequivocal support, but also aware that the damage had been done and that our relationship with his family had been fundamentally altered by his mother's public declaration of her true feelings about me. The remainder of the reception proceeded with forced normalcy as guests made valiant efforts to restore celebratory atmosphere through enthusiastic participation in dancing, conversation, and traditional wedding activities. Many people approached me privately to express their shock at Patricia's behavior and their admiration for my response, offering words of support and encouragement that helped mitigate some of the sting from the public humiliation I had endured. Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, the wife of David's former college professor, was particularly generous in her praise. "My dear," she said while we stood together near the dessert table, "I have attended hundreds of weddings and social events over the past 40 years, and I have never seen anyone handle such appalling behavior with more grace and dignity. Your response was absolutely perfect, and anyone with sense can see exactly what kind of person you are, versus what kind of person would make such comments at their own son's wedding." Her words were echoed by numerous other guests throughout the evening, creating a chorus of support that helped restore my confidence and reminded me that most reasonable people could distinguish between authentic character and baseless accusations. The overwhelming response from our wedding guests was one of horror at Patricia's behavior and admiration for my composed response, suggesting that her attempt to undermine me had largely backfired and instead revealed her own character deficiencies. However, the damage to family relationships was severe and lasting. William Hartwell, David's father, approached me later in the evening to offer what appeared to be an apology, but was actually a justification for his wife's behavior. "Patricia is very protective of David," he explained in the tone of someone who had spent years making excuses for inappropriate conduct. "She has seen other young women pursue him for financial reasons, and she sometimes overreacts when she perceives potential threats to his well-being." His explanation revealed the family's fundamental misunderstanding of our relationship dynamics and their inability to comprehend that I had achieved financial independence that exceeded their son's earning potential. In their minds, any woman who married David must be seeking financial advantage, regardless of evidence to the contrary. They could not conceive of a relationship where the woman was the primary earner or where financial motivations might flow in the opposite direction from their assumptions. David's siblings, who had remained silent during the confrontation, offered lukewarm apologies that suggested embarrassment about the public nature of the incident, rather than genuine disagreement with the underlying sentiment. His sister Jennifer murmured something about Patricia being stressed about the wedding, while his brother Michael explained that their mother just wants what is best for David, without acknowledging that her public humiliation of his wife was hardly in his best interests. The ride home that evening was quiet and tense as David and I processed what had occurred and began to understand the implications for our future relationship with his family. David was furious with his mother and ashamed of her behavior. But he was also clearly struggling with the complexity of navigating between loyalty to his wife and his lifelong relationship with his parents. I appreciated his immediate and public support during the confrontation, but I also recognized that this incident represented the beginning of a long-term challenge rather than an isolated event. "I knew my mother had concerns," David said, as we sat in our apartment later that night, still wearing our wedding attire but feeling far from celebratory. "But I never imagined she would say something so cruel in public. I am mortified by her behavior, and I want you to know that her opinions do not reflect my feelings or my family's true values." I listened to his explanations and apologies with appreciation for his intentions, but I also recognized that his mother's behavior had been too calculated and deliberate to be dismissed as a momentary lapse in judgment or excessive wedding stress. Patricia had chosen her words carefully, delivered them with confidence, and maintained her composure throughout the confrontation in ways that suggested premeditation rather than emotional outburst. More importantly, I realized that Patricia's public attack represented her actual opinion about me, rather than a misguided attempt to protect her son. She genuinely believed that I had pursued David for financial reasons, and she felt entitled to share that belief with 300 wedding guests as a way of establishing her perspective on our marriage. Her behavior revealed not just personal animosity toward me, but fundamental disrespect for David's judgment and autonomy in choosing his life partner. The following days brought a series of phone calls and conversations as family members attempted to address the fallout from the wedding incident. Patricia called David to offer what she characterized as an apology, but was actually a restatement of her concerns about my motivations expressed in slightly more diplomatic language. She insisted that she had been misunderstood and that her comments had been intended as lighthearted acknowledgement of my business success, rather than serious accusations about gold-digging behavior. Her attempted explanations only reinforced my understanding that she remained committed to her original assessment of my character and motivations. She was not apologizing for her beliefs about me, but rather for expressing those beliefs in a manner that had created public embarrassment for the family. The distinction was important because it indicated that her fundamental hostility toward me remained unchanged and would likely manifest in different ways throughout our marriage. I made a decision during those difficult first days after our wedding that would shape my approach to family relationships for years to come. I would maintain absolute dignity and professionalism in all interactions with David's family, regardless of their behavior toward me. I would never allow them to provoke me into responses that could be characterized as emotional, inappropriate, or unprofessional. I would document their behavior carefully, but respond with grace, knowing that time would eventually reveal the truth about everyone's character and motivations. Most importantly, I committed to focusing my energy on building the kind of life and career that would make their opinions irrelevant. I would continue developing my company, serving my customers, and creating value in the world while maintaining the highest standards of integrity and professionalism. I would not allow their negativity to diminish my ambition or compromise my values, and I would trust that success achieved through ethical means would ultimately vindicate my character more effectively than any argument or confrontation. The wedding day humiliation had ended, but the real test of my character was just beginning. Patricia Hartwell had revealed her true feelings about me in the most public and hurtful way possible, but she had also unwittingly provided me with clarity about the challenges I would face and the strength I would need to overcome them. What she did not understand was that her attack had not weakened me, but rather crystallized my determination to prove that character, competence, and integrity would ultimately triumph over prejudice, assumption, and small-minded thinking. The woman she had called a gold digger was about to become the architect of opportunities that would transform not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who had underestimated her potential. The foundation for that transformation had been laid in humiliation, but it would be built through excellence. The week following our wedding reception passed in a blur of returned gifts, thank you notes, and careful conversations with friends and family members who had witnessed Patricia Hartwell's public attack on my character. Each phone call and visit brought expressions of support mixed with barely concealed curiosity about how David and I planned to navigate our relationship with his family moving forward. I maintained gracious responses to every inquiry, thanking people for their concern while deflecting questions about future family dynamics, with the diplomatic skills that my grandmother had taught me were essential for preserving dignity in difficult circumstances. David struggled more visibly with the aftermath of his mother's behavior. He oscillated between rage at her public humiliation of his wife and guilt about the position this created for our marriage. He called his parents repeatedly during those first days, demanding explanations and apologies that never materialized in forms that addressed the fundamental disrespect that had been displayed. His conversations with Patricia became increasingly heated as she maintained her position that her comments had been misinterpreted, and that her concerns about my motivations were legitimate parental protection rather than unfounded accusations. I listened to these phone calls with growing clarity about the dynamics that would define our extended family relationships. Patricia was not going to acknowledge the inappropriateness of her behavior because she genuinely believed her assessment of my character was accurate. She viewed herself as a protective mother who had courageously spoken truth about a manipulative daughter-in-law, regardless of the social embarrassment this had caused. Her repeated references to my calculated pursuit of David and my obvious financial motivations revealed that her wedding speech had been a public declaration of privately held beliefs rather than a momentary lapse in judgment. The realization that David's mother would never respect me or acknowledge my achievements, independent of her conspiracy theories about my marriage motivations, was initially devastating, but ultimately liberating. I stopped waiting for apologies that would never come and began focusing my energy on building the kind of life that would make her opinions irrelevant. If Patricia Hartwell wanted to view me as a gold digger, I would demonstrate through my actions the difference between someone who seeks wealth through manipulation and someone who creates value through innovation and hard work. My first priority was expanding my fintech company beyond its initial success to establish a foundation for long-term growth and impact. The platform had exceeded all initial projections for user acquisition and transaction volume, but I recognized that sustainable success would require continuous innovation, expanded service offerings, and strategic positioning within the rapidly evolving financial technology landscape. I needed to transform early momentum into lasting competitive advantages that would protect against larger companies attempting to replicate our approach. The user feedback we had received during our first year of operation revealed opportunities for service expansion that aligned perfectly with my original vision of democratizing financial opportunities for working-class families. Customers were requesting additional features, including automated savings programs, educational resources about investment strategies, debt consolidation tools, and small business financing options. Each request represented not just a revenue opportunity, but also a chance to create meaningful impact in areas where traditional financial institutions had consistently failed to serve ordinary families effectively. I decided to pursue aggressive expansion across multiple service areas simultaneously, recognizing that the current market conditions and our strong initial performance created a window of opportunity that might not remain open indefinitely. This strategy would require substantial additional investment, significant team expansion, and the development of new technological infrastructure, but it offered the potential to establish market leadership before competitors could develop similar, comprehensive platforms. The funding requirements for this expansion strategy exceeded what traditional venture capital firms typically provided to companies at our stage of development. I needed to raise $15 million to support the hiring, technology development, and marketing efforts necessary to capture the market opportunity I had identified. This meant approaching larger investment firms, pension funds, and strategic partners who could provide not just capital, but also the industry expertise and network connections that would accelerate our growth trajectory. Preparing for this funding round required months of intensive work developing financial projections, market analysis, competitive assessments, and strategic plans that would demonstrate our potential for achieving the scale and profitability that major investors demanded. I worked 18-hour days creating presentation materials, refining our business model, and preparing for the kind of high-stakes investor meetings that would determine whether my vision for democratizing financial services could become reality. The process was complicated by the ongoing tension with David's family, who continued to make comments about my work schedule and business priorities that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of entrepreneurial demands. During family phone calls, Patricia would ask David whether I was still working those excessive hours and express concern that my obsession with business success might interfere with my ability to be a proper wife and eventual mother. Her comments consistently framed my professional dedication as character flaws rather than admirable commitment to building something meaningful. David defended me consistently during these conversations, but I could see the emotional toll that navigating between family loyalty and spousal support was taking on him. He began suggesting that I consider reducing my work schedule or delegating more responsibilities to other team members, proposals that revealed his growing stress about managing competing demands from the two most important relationships in his life. I understood his position, but also recognized that compromising my professional ambitions to appease his family's expectations would validate their characterization of me as someone whose achievements were secondary to domestic obligations. Instead of reducing my professional commitments, I decided to increase them strategically, while ensuring that David felt supported and valued in our personal relationship. I scheduled dedicated time for our marriage that was completely separate from work obligations, planned regular activities that strengthened our emotional connection, and maintained open communication about how we could best support each other while pursuing our individual and shared goals. I demonstrated that professional excellence and personal commitment were not mutually exclusive, but rather complementary aspects of building a meaningful life. The investor meetings began in earnest during the spring following our wedding, starting with preliminary conversations with venture capital firms that had expressed interest in our platform during its initial launch phase. These early meetings served as practice sessions that allowed me to refine my presentation approach and develop more sophisticated responses to the challenging questions that sophisticated investors typically asked about market competition, technological advantages, and scalability potential. My preparation for these meetings was exhaustive and methodical. I studied the investment history and portfolio companies of every firm we approached, researched the backgrounds and investment preferences of individual partners, and developed customized presentation materials that address the specific concerns and opportunities that each investor would find most compelling. I practiced my presentations repeatedly, anticipated potential objections, and prepared detailed responses supported by comprehensive data analysis. The breakthrough came during a meeting with Morrison Capital Partners, a mid-stage investment firm that specialized in financial technology companies, with proven market traction and clear paths to significant scale. The managing partner, Rebecca Morrison, had built her reputation by identifying and supporting innovative companies that addressed underserved markets through technological solutions. Her portfolio included several companies that had successfully challenged established financial institutions by providing better service to previously neglected customer segments. My presentation to Morrison Capital Partners lasted 3 hours and covered every aspect of our business model, competitive positioning, growth strategy, and market opportunity. I demonstrated our platform's capabilities through live user interface, walkthroughs, presented detailed analysis of our customer acquisition costs and lifetime value metrics, and outlined the specific expansion initiatives that additional funding would enable. Most importantly, I articulated the social impact potential of our work and explained how financial success would be achieved through genuine value creation rather than market manipulation or customer exploitation. Rebecca Morrison's response exceeded my most optimistic expectations. She described our platform as exactly the kind of innovation that the financial services industry desperately needs, and praised our approach to serving markets that traditional institutions had systematically ignored. She was particularly impressed by our user retention rates and organic growth metrics, which demonstrated that customers were finding genuine value in our services, rather than simply trying our platform briefly before returning to traditional banking relationships. The due diligence process that followed was intensive and comprehensive, requiring detailed examination of our financial records, customer data, technological infrastructure, competitive analysis, and regulatory compliance. Procedures. Morrison Capital Partners deployed teams of specialists to evaluate every aspect of our business, from software architecture to customer service protocols. The process was demanding, but also validating, as each area of investigation confirmed the strength of the foundation we had built and the viability of our expansion plans. During this period, I continued to receive periodic updates about David's family dynamics through his phone conversations and occasional visits to Ohio. Patricia's commentary about our marriage had evolved from direct criticism of my character to more subtle expressions of concern about our lifestyle choices and priorities. She would ask whether we were planning to start a family soon, and wonder aloud whether my business commitments would allow for proper attention to domestic responsibilities. Her questions were framed as maternal concern, but clearly reflected her continued belief that my professional success was somehow incompatible with being a good wife. The irony of these conversations was that my business success was creating exactly the kind of financial security that Patricia claimed to value for her son. The equity I had built in my company already exceeded the total net worth of David's entire extended family, and the expansion we were planning would potentially create generational wealth that could benefit not just David and me, but also any children we might have. My work was providing the financial foundation that would allow us to make life choices based on personal preferences rather than economic necessity, yet Patricia continued to view my professional achievements as threats rather than advantages. The investment agreement with Morrison Capital Partners was finalized in late summer, providing $15 million in exchange for a minority equity stake that preserved my control over company direction while bringing experienced investors into our governance structure. The funding announcement generated significant media attention within the financial technology industry, with several publications describing our platform as a potential disruptor that could challenge established wealth management companies by serving markets they had neglected. The validation that came from this investment round was profound and multifaceted. Financial industry experts were recognizing the significance of our approach and the potential for meaningful market impact. Sophisticated investors were committing substantial capital based on their assessment of our growth prospects and competitive advantages. Most importantly, we now had the resources necessary to execute the expansion strategy that would transform us from a promising startup into a comprehensive financial services platform. I celebrated this milestone quietly but meaningfully, taking David to dinner at the restaurant where we had shared our first meal together after my Stanford presentation 3 years earlier. We reflected on the journey that had brought us from that initial conversation about democratizing investment opportunities to the reality of building a company that was changing how working families accessed wealth-building tools. The evening was a reminder that our relationship had been built on shared values and mutual respect for each other's ambitions, regardless of what his family believed about my motivations. The conversation that evening also included our first serious discussion about starting a family of our own. David expressed his desire to become a father and his confidence that we could balance parenthood with our professional commitments. I shared my enthusiasm for eventually having children, while also explaining that the next 18 months would be critical for establishing our company's market position and that timing our family expansion carefully would benefit both our personal and professional goals. This discussion proved prescient when Patricia called David the following week to inquire about our family planning timeline. Her questions revealed that she had been discussing our marriage with other family members and had developed theories about why we had not yet announced pregnancy news. She suggested that my career obsession might be preventing us from fulfilling our proper roles as married adults, and wondered whether David was happy with a wife who prioritizes business over family. David's response to his mother's inquiries was firm and comprehensive. He explained that our family planning decisions were private matters that did not require external input or approval. He described my professional achievements with pride and emphasized that my success created opportunities for our family rather than obstacles to happiness. Most importantly, he made clear that continued criticism of his wife would damage his relationship with his parents more severely than any business commitment could damage our marriage. The conversation marked a turning point in David's approach to managing family dynamics. Rather than attempting to bridge differences or find compromises between competing loyalties, he established clear boundaries about acceptable behavior and made explicit that his primary commitment was to our marriage partnership. This evolution in his approach strengthened our relationship, while also clarifying for his family that their attempts to undermine me would not succeed in creating marital discord. The team expansion that followed our investment round was rapid and strategic, focusing on hiring experienced professionals who could accelerate our growth while maintaining the customer-focused culture that had driven our initial success. We recruited senior developers from established financial technology companies, hired customer service specialists with backgrounds in serving diverse populations, and brought on marketing professionals who understood how to reach working families through channels they trusted and preferred. Each new hire represented not just increased capacity, but also validation of our mission and approach. Talented professionals were leaving established companies to join our team because they believed in the importance of democratizing financial opportunities and wanted to contribute to meaningful social impact. Their decisions to risk career moves based on our vision confirmed that we were building something significant that would attract the best people regardless of our company's relative youth. The product development work that began during this expansion phase was the most challenging and rewarding of my professional career. We were essentially building multiple interconnected platforms simultaneously, each requiring sophisticated technology, regulatory compliance, and user interface design that would make complex financial concepts accessible to people with varying levels of educational and technological background. The engineering challenges were substantial, but they were matched by the satisfaction of creating tools that would genuinely improve people's financial circumstances. By winter, our expanded platform was ready for beta testing with select user groups who had volunteered to provide feedback on new features before general release. The response from these early users exceeded our expectations and confirmed that our expansion strategy addressed real needs that existing financial services had failed to meet effectively. Users particularly appreciated the educational components that helped them understand investment principles, the automated savings features that made wealth building effortless, and the small business financing tools that provided alternatives to traditional bank lending. The success of our beta testing phase positioned us for a major product launch that would occur during the following spring, coinciding with tax season when many people were particularly focused on financial planning and investment opportunities. This timing would maximize media attention and user acquisition while demonstrating our platform's comprehensive capabilities during a period when financial services were particularly relevant to our target customers. As I reflected on the year that had passed since Patricia Hartwell's wedding speech, I realized that her attempt to diminish me had actually catalyzed the most productive and successful period of my professional career. Her public characterization of me as a gold digger had motivated me to demonstrate the difference between seeking wealth through manipulation and creating value through innovation. The company I was building would eventually provide financial opportunities to millions of families while generating returns for investors who supported our mission. More importantly, the experience had taught me that external validation from people who did not understand or appreciate my values was unnecessary for personal satisfaction or professional success. Patricia's opinion of my character had no bearing on my actual character, just as her misunderstanding of my motivations had no impact on my genuine commitment to David and our marriage. I had learned to focus on outcomes rather than opinions, on building rather than defending, and on creating value rather than seeking approval. The foundation for everything that would follow had been established through resilience, determination, and unwavering commitment to excellence. The woman Patricia Hartwell had called a gold digger was becoming the architect of opportunities that would eventually transform the lives of everyone who had underestimated her potential, including the family members who had dismissed her achievements as calculated pursuit of financial advantage. The real transformation was just beginning. The months following our wedding marked the beginning of a sophisticated campaign of psychological undermining that revealed the true extent of Patricia Hartwell's commitment to her narrative about my character and motivations. Rather than accepting David's clear boundaries about criticism of our marriage, she evolved her approach to become more subtle but equally persistent in her efforts to validate her original assessment of me as a manipulative gold digger who had trapped her son through calculated deception. Her methods became increasingly refined and strategic, designed to create doubt and tension without providing clear evidence that could be confronted directly. The transformation began with Patricia's approach to family communication and social interactions. Previously, her criticism had been direct and explicit, making it easy for David to identify inappropriate behavior and respond accordingly. Now, her concerns were expressed through seemingly innocent questions and carefully worded observations that appeared to demonstrate maternal interest, while actually conveying disapproval and suspicion. She developed a talent for making statements that could be interpreted multiple ways, allowing her to maintain plausible deniability while ensuring that her true feelings remained clear to anyone who listened carefully. During family phone calls, Patricia would inquire about our daily routines and lifestyle choices in ways that consistently highlighted what she viewed as evidence of my inappropriate priorities and character flaws. She would ask David whether I was still working those long hours and wonder aloud whether such dedication to business success was healthy for a young marriage. Her questions were framed as concern for our well-being, but they consistently implied that my professional commitment represented selfishness or obsession, rather than admirable work ethic and dedication to building something meaningful. These conversations often included comparisons to other family members and acquaintances who had made different life choices that Patricia clearly preferred. She would share updates about David's cousins who had settled down properly after marriage, emphasizing their focus on domestic responsibilities and traditional gender roles. She would mention neighbors and family friends whose wives had put family first by reducing professional commitments after marriage, suggesting that such choices reflected superior values and character. The comparisons were never explicitly directed toward our situation, but their relevance was obvious and intentional. Patricia also developed a pattern of making observations about our financial circumstances that revealed her continued belief that I had pursued David for economic advantage despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. She would comment on purchases we made or trips we took in ways that suggested surprise at our spending capacity, as if she expected that I would eventually be unable to maintain the lifestyle I had established before our marriage. Her surprise seemed to stem from confusion about why someone who had married for money would continue to spend her own resources rather than depending entirely on her husband's income. The most insidious aspect of Patricia's evolved approach was her strategy of expressing concern about my influence on David's character and decision-making. She would observe that he seemed different since our marriage and wonder whether he was still the same person she had raised. These comments implied that I was somehow corrupting or manipulating him, transforming him from the son she recognized into someone whose values and priorities had been compromised by exposure to my worldview and ambitions. David initially dismissed these concerns as typical maternal adjustment difficulties that would resolve naturally as his family became more accustomed to our marriage. He believed that consistent demonstration of our happiness and compatibility would eventually convince his parents that their initial assessment had been incorrect. He encouraged me to participate in family events and conversations, hoping that increased exposure would allow his family to see my genuine character and appreciate the positive impact of our relationship on his life. I participated in these efforts despite growing recognition that Patricia's hostility was fundamental rather than situational. I joined family phone calls, sent birthday cards and holiday gifts, and made genuine efforts to engage with David's relatives in ways that demonstrated respect and affection for the family connections that were important to him. I maintained perfect courtesy and consideration in all interactions, refusing to provide any behavior that could be interpreted as evidence supporting Patricia's theories about my character. However, my efforts to build positive relationships with David's family were consistently undermined by Patricia's ability to reinterpret any gesture or comment in ways that confirmed her existing beliefs about my motivations. When I sent thoughtful gifts, she would comment on their expense and wonder aloud whether such generosity was calculated to make an impression. When I offered professional advice or business insights during conversations, she would suggest that I was showing off or trying to prove something rather than simply participating in normal family discussion. The pattern became clear during a family gathering in Ohio that David and I attended 6 months after our wedding. I had prepared carefully for this visit, hoping to demonstrate through direct interaction that I was someone his family could genuinely like and respect if they were willing to set aside their preconceptions. I brought thoughtful gifts for everyone, participated enthusiastically in family traditions, and made genuine efforts to learn about their interests and perspectives. The visit proceeded smoothly on the surface, with everyone maintaining polite conversation and appropriate social behavior. However, I gradually became aware of subtle dynamics that revealed the true nature of how I was being perceived and discussed. Family members would make comments about my clothing, my mannerisms, or my responses to questions that seemed innocuous individually, but created a cumulative impression of constant evaluation and judgment. I felt as though every word and gesture was being analyzed for evidence of the manipulative character that Patricia had described to them. The most revealing moment came during a conversation about family history and traditions, when Patricia shared stories about previous generations and the values that had shaped their family identity. She emphasized themes about the importance of humility, the dangers of materialism, and the significance of maintaining proper priorities between professional ambition and family obligations. Her stories were presented as general family wisdom, but their relevance to perceived flaws in my character was obvious to everyone present. When I attempted to share stories about my own family background and the values that my grandmother had instilled in me, Patricia listened with polite attention, but responded in ways that suggested skepticism about the authenticity of my experiences. She would ask pointed questions about details or make observations that implied doubt about whether my family's values were genuine or simply convenient narratives I had constructed to make favorable impressions. Her questioning technique was sophisticated enough to avoid obvious rudeness, while making clear that she viewed my contributions to family conversations as strategic performances rather than authentic sharing. David observed these dynamics with growing frustration and began to understand that his family's resistance to accepting me was more entrenched than he had initially recognized. He attempted to address the situation through private conversations with family members, explaining our relationship more thoroughly and asking them to give me genuine opportunities to demonstrate my character rather than interpreting everything through pre-existing assumptions. His efforts were received politely but without meaningful change in behavior or attitude. The weekend visit concluded with superficial expressions of appreciation for our attendance and generic invitations to return soon. But I left Ohio with clear understanding that Patricia's campaign against me had been largely successful in poisoning family relationships beyond immediate repair. David's relatives had been convinced that I was someone whose motivations required constant scrutiny and whose presence in their family represented a threat to their values and traditions. They would never see me as simply David's wife, who deserved basic respect and inclusion, but rather as an outsider whose continued presence required tolerance rather than acceptance. The drive home provided an opportunity for David and me to process what had occurred and discuss how we wanted to navigate family relationships moving forward. David was clearly disturbed by what he had observed and apologetic about his family's treatment of me, but he was also struggling with the complexity of managing relationships that were important to him despite their negative impact on our marriage. He wanted to maintain connections with his family while protecting me from continued hostility, a balance that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve. I used this conversation to establish clear expectations about how I was willing to engage with his family in the future. I explained that I would continue to treat everyone with courtesy and respect, but that I would not subject myself to repeated situations where my character was questioned and my motives were suspected without cause. I would participate in major family events and maintain appropriate social connections, but I would not invest emotional energy in trying to change minds that were closed to evidence that contradicted established narratives. Most importantly, I made clear that I would not allow family tensions to compromise my professional commitments or personal goals. I had worked too hard and achieved too much to permit other people's misconceptions to limit my potential or divert my focus from building the kind of life and career that aligned with my values. If David's family wanted to view my success as evidence of character flaws rather than admirable achievement, that reflected their limitations rather than my failings. This conversation marked an important evolution in how David and I approached external pressures on our marriage. Rather than allowing family dynamics to create internal conflict between us, we committed to presenting a united front that prioritized our relationship and shared goals above the preferences or opinions of relatives who did not understand or support our choices. David recognized that his primary obligation was to our marriage partnership, while I accepted that family relationships would remain complicated but manageable if we maintained clear boundaries and realistic expectations. The resolution to focus on our own lives rather than managing family perceptions proved remarkably liberating and productive. I channeled the energy I had been devoting to family relationship management into accelerating the growth and expansion of my company, pursuing new opportunities with increased intensity and strategic focus. The beta testing phase of our expanded platform had exceeded all projections, confirming that our comprehensive approach to financial services was addressing genuine market needs that existing institutions had failed to meet effectively. The success of our expanded offerings created opportunities for additional business development that would establish market leadership before competitors could develop similar comprehensive platforms. I identified strategic partnership opportunities with established companies that served our target demographics, explored acquisition possibilities that would accelerate our geographical expansion, and investigated technological innovations that would maintain our competitive advantages as the financial technology industry continued to evolve rapidly. This period of intensive business development coincided with growing economic pressures in the Rust Belt region where David's family lived. The manufacturing sector that had historically provided economic stability for Ohio communities was experiencing continued decline, with plant closures and job losses creating financial stress for working families throughout the region. Local unemployment rates were rising, property values were declining, and young people were leaving for opportunities in more economically dynamic areas. David's father, William, had been experiencing these economic pressures directly through his small manufacturing company, which produced automotive parts for an industry that was increasingly outsourcing production to lower-cost international suppliers. His customer base was shrinking as automotive companies consolidated their supply chains and relocated manufacturing operations to countries with lower labor costs. The company that had provided comfortable middle-class income for his family was struggling to maintain profitability in an increasingly competitive and cost-conscious market environment. Patricia's part-time work as a substitute teacher was also being affected by school district budget constraints that were reducing educational staffing throughout the region. Her income had never been substantial, but the additional financial pressure created by reduced teaching opportunities was contributing to growing stress about their overall economic situation. The comfortable lifestyle that the Hartwell family had enjoyed was becoming more difficult to maintain as their income sources became less reliable and their expenses continued to increase. David's siblings were facing similar challenges as they attempted to establish careers and build families in an economically declining region. His sister Jennifer had completed a nursing degree but was struggling to find full-time employment that provided adequate benefits and career advancement opportunities. His brother Michael was working in sales for a regional business that was experiencing declining revenues as local companies reduced their purchasing due to their own financial constraints. The contrast between the economic challenges facing David's family and the rapid growth of my company created an ironic dynamic that none of us fully recognized at the time. While Patricia continued to characterize me as someone who had pursued her son for financial advantage, my business success was creating exactly the kind of economic security that her family was losing through no fault of their own. The gold digger she had publicly denounced was building wealth and creating opportunities at a pace that exceeded anything their traditional approach to financial stability had ever achieved. My company's expansion strategy included plans to establish regional offices in economically distressed areas where we could access talented workers while providing good jobs in communities that needed economic development. The Rust Belt region represented an attractive location for expansion because it offered a skilled workforce, lower operational costs, and the opportunity to create meaningful economic impact in communities that had been neglected by other growing companies. The decision to consider Ohio as a potential expansion location was based purely on business considerations rather than personal family dynamics. The region met all our criteria for operational efficiency, talent acquisition, and market penetration. The fact that David's family lived in the same general area was coincidental rather than intentional, but it would eventually create opportunities for intersection between my professional success and their economic circumstances. As I developed detailed plans for regional expansion, I occasionally wondered how Patricia would respond if my company became a significant employer in her community. Would she recognize the irony of the gold digger creating job opportunities for local families? Would she acknowledge that the business success she had characterized as evidence of manipulative character was actually contributing to economic development in her struggling region? Or would she find ways to maintain her narrative regardless of evidence that contradicted her fundamental assumptions about my motivations and impact? These questions remained theoretical during the planning phase, but they would become practical realities sooner than anyone anticipated. The foundation for a dramatic reversal of circumstances was being established through business success that no amount of family hostility could diminish or compromise. The woman Patricia Hartwell had tried to undermine through subtle psychological warfare was building the kind of enterprise that would eventually provide opportunities for the very people who had questioned her character and dismissed her achievements. The campaign of undermining had failed to achieve its intended effect of creating doubt or limitation. Instead, it had clarified my priorities and strengthened my resolve to succeed regardless of external negativity. The real test of character was not how I responded to criticism, but how I transformed that criticism into motivation for creating value that would benefit everyone, including those who had underestimated my potential and misunderstood my motivations. The foundation for transformation had been laid through resilience, determination, and unwavering commitment to building something meaningful. The next phase would demonstrate how excellence achieved through integrity could create opportunities that would reshape the lives of everyone who had participated in dismissing the woman they called a gold digger. The second year of our marriage brought a calculated intensification of Patricia Hartwell's campaign to undermine my relationship with David and validate her characterization of me as a manipulative opportunist who had deceived her son about my true nature and motivations. Her approach evolved from subtle questioning and passive-aggressive commentary to a more systematic strategy that involved recruiting extended family members, family friends, and community connections to support her narrative about my character, flaws, and the threat I represented to traditional family values and stability. Patricia's expanded campaign began with carefully orchestrated conversations during family gatherings and social events, where she would share concerns about David's well-being and happiness since our marriage. She developed a sophisticated ability to present herself as a worried mother who was simply trying to understand troubling changes she had observed in her son's behavior and priorities. Her concerns were always framed as questions rather than accusations, allowing her to plant seeds of doubt while maintaining plausible deniability about her true intentions. During holiday celebrations and family reunions, Patricia would engage other relatives in discussions about marriage dynamics and family responsibilities, using David and me as examples of concerning trends in modern relationships. She would wonder aloud whether young people today understood the importance of putting family obligations before professional ambitions, whether contemporary marriages were based on genuine love or calculated advantage, and whether traditional values were being abandoned in favor of materialistic pursuits that ultimately led to unhappiness and instability. These conversations were structured to appear as general observations about social trends rather than specific criticism of our marriage, but their relevance to our situation was obvious to everyone present. Patricia would share anecdotes about other couples she knew who had struggled because one partner was too focused on career advancement, or where financial differences had created unhealthy power dynamics that damaged the relationship foundation. Her stories consistently implied that professional success by women created problems for marriages rather than contributing to family stability and security. The effectiveness of Patricia's strategy became apparent during subsequent family interactions. When relatives began asking David probing questions about our marriage that clearly reflected conversations they had experienced with his mother, his aunts would inquire about whether he was happy with how things were going, and whether he felt supported in his own career goals. His uncles would make comments about the importance of maintaining proper balance between work and family commitments. His cousins would share updates about their own relationships that emphasized traditional gender roles and domestic priorities. These family conversations created subtle but persistent pressure on David to acknowledge problems in our marriage that did not actually exist. The cumulative effect was to suggest that our relationship was unusual and potentially problematic, rather than simply different from the traditional model that his family preferred. David found himself repeatedly defending choices and circumstances that he had never previously questioned, explaining why our arrangement worked well for us despite its deviation from conventional expectations. Patricia's campaign also extended to community connections and social networks that had significance for David's family identity and reputation. She began sharing her concerns about our marriage with neighbors, church members, and longtime family. Friends who had watched David grow up and maintained interest in his adult life and happiness. These conversations allowed her to present herself as a devoted mother, seeking advice and support, while simultaneously spreading her narrative about my questionable character and inappropriate influence on her son. The community outreach component of Patricia's strategy was particularly insidious because it created a network of people who viewed me with suspicion and disapproval before ever meeting me or witnessing any actual evidence of problematic behavior. When David and I attended community events or visited his hometown, we encountered subtle hostility and judgment from people who had been primed to see me as a threat to traditional values and family stability rather than simply as David's wife, who deserved basic courtesy and respect. During one particularly uncomfortable church service that we attended while visiting Ohio, I observed multiple instances of people staring, whispering, and making obvious efforts to avoid direct interaction with me. The few conversations I did have were stilted and awkward, with community members asking questions that clearly reflected prior discussions about my background and motivations. I felt like an exhibit in a museum rather than a guest at a religious service, with people studying me for evidence that would confirm or contradict the stories they had heard about my character. The most damaging aspect of Patricia's expanded campaign was her decision to involve David's professional network and career connections in her efforts to validate her concerns about our marriage. She began contacting former colleagues, college friends, and professional mentors who maintained relationships with David, expressing worry about changes she had observed in his priorities and decision-making since our wedding. She suggested that I was encouraging him to make career choices that prioritized financial gain over personal satisfaction and professional integrity. These professional interventions created particularly difficult situations for David because they threatened to damage relationships that were important for his career advancement and industry reputation. When former colleagues called to express concern about his well-being or to offer unsolicited advice about marriage dynamics, he was forced to navigate between maintaining professional relationships and defending his wife from unfounded accusations. The conversations were awkward and uncomfortable, creating stress about both personal and professional circumstances. Patricia's most sophisticated manipulation involved her strategic use of financial concerns and economic anxiety to validate her narrative about my motivations for marrying David. She began sharing detailed information about their family's economic challenges with relatives and community connections, emphasizing how difficult it was to maintain their lifestyle and financial stability in the current economic environment. She would then contrast their financial stress with what she characterized as my excessive spending and materialistic lifestyle, suggesting that I was draining resources that should be preserved for family security. Her financial narrative was particularly effective because it contained elements of truth about the economic pressures facing their community, while completely misrepresenting the actual dynamics of our marriage finances. Patricia accurately described the declining manufacturing sector, rising unemployment rates, and financial stress affecting many local families, but she incorrectly attributed our financial stability to David's income rather than my business success. Her selective presentation of information created a compelling story about economic exploitation that resonated with people who were experiencing their own financial difficulties. The irony of Patricia's financial arguments was that my company's success was creating exactly the kind of economic security and opportunity that her family and community desperately needed. While she characterized me as someone who was taking advantage of their son for financial gain, my business was generating wealth and creating jobs at a scale that could potentially transform the economic prospects of entire communities. The Sao gold digger, she denounced, was building an enterprise that represented hope for economic development in regions that had been abandoned by other growing companies. My response to Patricia's escalating campaign was to maintain absolute focus on building value and creating positive impact through my professional work, while refusing to be drawn into defensive reactions that would validate her characterization of me as someone whose motivations required constant justification. I recognized that any attempt to directly counter her narrative would be interpreted as evidence of guilt or manipulation, while continued success and positive contribution would eventually speak more persuasively than any argument or explanation. The business expansion that continued throughout this period provided concrete validation of my approach and values. Our platform had exceeded all growth projections and was generating substantial revenue while serving customers who had been systematically excluded from traditional financial services. User testimonials consistently emphasized how our tools had enabled them to build wealth, achieve financial goals, and create security for their families in ways that had previously seemed impossible. The social impact of our work was measurable and meaningful, creating genuine value that improved people's lives while generating sustainable returns for investors. The technological innovations we developed during this expansion phase positioned us as industry leaders in democratizing access to sophisticated financial tools and investment opportunities. Our algorithms could analyze individual financial circumstances and recommend personalized strategies for wealth building that would have required expensive professional advisors in traditional settings. We had essentially created a comprehensive financial planning service that was accessible to working families regardless of their income level or educational background. The market recognition of our innovations began attracting attention from major financial institutions and technology companies who were interested in partnership opportunities or acquisition discussions. Several Fortune 500 companies approached us about licensing our technology or acquiring our platform to enhance their own service offerings. These conversations represented validation from industry leaders who recognized the commercial and social value of what we had built, confirming that our approach was not just innovative, but also scalable and sustainable. The professional recognition I received during this period included invitations to speak at major industry conferences, requests for interviews with financial media outlets, and appointments to advisory boards for organizations focused on financial inclusion and economic development. These opportunities allowed me to share our mission and approach with broader audiences while establishing thought leadership in areas that aligned with my values and expertise. Each speaking engagement and media appearance enhanced our company's visibility and credibility while demonstrating the depth of knowledge and commitment that had driven our success. The contrast between my growing professional recognition and Patricia's continued character assassination created cognitive dissonance for family members and community connections who were being asked to believe that someone achieving such visible success was actually a manipulative opportunist. The disconnect between her narrative and observable reality became increasingly difficult to maintain as evidence of my competence and integrity accumulated through public recognition and professional achievements. David began to recognize the sophistication and persistence of his mother's campaign during this period, particularly as he observed how family relationships and community connections were being systematically poisoned against me despite my consistent demonstration of respect and consideration for everyone involved. He realized that Patricia's hostility was not based on legitimate concerns about our marriage, but rather on fundamental inability to accept that her son had married someone whose success and independence challenged her assumptions about appropriate gender roles and family dynamics. The evolution of David's understanding led to increasingly direct confrontations with his mother about her behavior and its impact on our marriage and family relationships. He demanded that she stop discussing our marriage with extended family members and community connections, explaining that her interference was creating unnecessary conflict and damaging relationships that were important to him. He made clear that continued attempts to undermine me would result in reduced contact with him and exclusion from significant events in our lives. Patricia's response to David's confrontations revealed the depth of her commitment to her narrative about my character. Rather than acknowledging inappropriate behavior or agreeing to modify her approach, she doubled down on her concerns and expanded her efforts to recruit support from other family members who could continue pressuring David to recognize what she characterized as obvious problems in our relationship. She interpreted his defense of me as further evidence that I had manipulated him into abandoning his family values and loyalties. The family dynamics that emerged from these confrontations created clear divisions between relatives who supported David's autonomy and marriage choices and those who aligned with Patricia's concerns about my influence on his character and priorities. These divisions would have lasting implications for family relationships and would eventually affect how different family members responded when economic circumstances created opportunities for them to interact with my company in professional, rather than personal contexts. Meanwhile, the economic pressures affecting David's family and community continued to intensify as manufacturing job losses accelerated and local businesses struggled to maintain viability in an increasingly challenging economic environment. William Hartwell's automotive parts company was experiencing severe financial stress as customers consolidated their supply chains and demanded price reductions that eliminated profit margins. The company that had provided comfortable middle-class income for decades was facing potential closure or bankruptcy within the next 18 months. Patricia's substitute teaching income had been reduced further as school districts implemented additional budget cuts that eliminated many part-time positions. Her financial contribution to household expenses had essentially disappeared, creating additional pressure on William's declining business income to maintain their lifestyle and meet financial obligations. The economic security that had allowed them to maintain their social position and community standing was eroding rapidly, despite their best efforts to adapt to changing circumstances. David's siblings were experiencing similar financial pressures as the regional economy continued to deteriorate. Jennifer had been unable to find full-time nursing employment that provided adequate benefits and career advancement opportunities, forcing her to work multiple part-time positions without job security or comprehensive healthcare coverage. Michael's sales position had been eliminated due to company downsizing, and he was struggling to find comparable employment in a region where many businesses were reducing rather than expanding their workforce. The cumulative effect of these economic pressures was to create exactly the kind of financial stress and uncertainty that my fintech platform had been designed to address. Working families throughout the region were experiencing reduced income, increased expenses, and limited access to financial tools that could help them navigate economic challenges and build stability for the future. The problems facing David's family were representative of broader systemic issues that required innovative solutions rather than traditional approaches that had become inadequate for current economic realities. The irony of the situation was becoming increasingly apparent to me, even if it remained invisible to Patricia and other family members who continued to characterize me as a threat rather than a potential resource. The business I had built was specifically designed to serve families experiencing exactly the kind of economic challenges that David's relatives were facing, while the regional expansion I was planning would create employment opportunities in communities that desperately needed economic development and job creation. The woman Patricia Hartwell had spent 2 years characterizing as a gold digger was becoming positioned to provide economic opportunities and financial solutions for the very people who had supported her campaign of character assassination. Foundation for a dramatic reversal of circumstances was being established through business success that would eventually demonstrate the difference between someone who seeks advantage through manipulation and someone who creates value through innovation and hard work. The strategic campaign to undermine me was about to encounter the reality of economic necessity, and the results would reveal the true character of everyone involved in ways that no amount of psychological warfare could obscure or manipulate. The weight of systematic character assassination becomes most apparent not in the moments of direct confrontation, but in the quiet hours when you find yourself questioning truths you have always known about your own motivations, values, and worth. During the third year of our marriage, as Patricia Hartwell's campaign against my character reached its most sophisticated and pervasive phase, I discovered that the greatest challenge was not defending myself against external attacks, but maintaining internal clarity about who I was and what I was building despite the constant barrage of doubt and disapproval that surrounded every aspect of my life. The psychological impact of sustained hostility from people who should have been family created a form of emotional exhaustion that was unlike anything I had experienced during the most challenging periods of building my business or navigating professional setbacks. When competitors questioned my market strategy or investors challenged my financial projections, I could respond with data, evidence, and logical arguments that addressed their concerns directly. When family members questioned my character and motivations, there was no amount of evidence that could change minds that were committed to maintaining their predetermined narrative about my fundamental nature. I began to understand how psychological warfare operates through accumulation rather than dramatic events. Each individual incident of subtle criticism, passive-aggressive questioning, or community gossip might seem manageable in isolation, but the cumulative effect created a constant background noise of negativity that required conscious effort to ignore and counteract. I found myself developing mental strategies for maintaining emotional equilibrium while surrounded by people who were actively working to undermine my confidence and sense of belonging. The most challenging aspect of this psychological pressure was the way it created doubt about perceptions and interpretations that I had previously trusted without question. When Patricia made comments that seemed designed to hurt or diminish me, I would find myself wondering whether I was overreacting or misinterpreting innocent remarks as deliberate attacks. When family gatherings consistently left me feeling excluded and unwelcome, I questioned whether my discomfort reflected their hostility or my own sensitivity and defensiveness. This self-doubt was particularly insidious because it operated against my natural tendency toward introspection and self-improvement. I had always valued the ability to examine my own behavior objectively and make adjustments when I recognized areas for growth or development. Patricia's campaign exploited this strength by creating situations where reasonable self-examination could be twisted into validation of her narrative about my character flaws and inappropriate motivations. The process of maintaining clarity about my own truth while surrounded by people who were committed to a different version of that truth required developing new forms of mental discipline and emotional resilience. I began keeping a private journal where I recorded not just events and interactions, but my own thoughts and feelings about what was occurring. Writing became a way of processing experiences that might otherwise have created confusion or self-doubt, allowing me to identify patterns and maintain perspective about the difference between legitimate feedback and malicious manipulation. The journal entries from this period reveal the evolution of my understanding about the nature of the challenge I was facing and the strategies I needed to develop to maintain my emotional and psychological well-being. Early entries focused on analyzing specific incidents and trying to understand what I might have done differently to create better outcomes. Gradually, the entries shifted toward recognition that the problem was not my behavior, but rather the fundamental unwillingness of certain people to accept evidence that contradicted their preferred narrative about my character. This recognition was both liberating and isolating. Understanding that Patricia's hostility was based on her own psychological needs rather than my actual behavior freed me from the exhausting effort to modify my actions in hopes of earning acceptance that would never be offered. However, it also clarified that family relationships would remain permanently damaged, regardless of how perfectly I conducted myself or how successfully I demonstrated my genuine care for David and respect for his family connections. The isolation was compounded by the reality that most people in my professional and social networks had no frame of reference for understanding the sustained family hostility I was experiencing. when colleagues asked about my marriage or family relationships. I found it difficult to explain the complexity of the situation without sounding defensive or vindictive. The dynamics were too subtle and sophisticated to be easily summarized, and attempts to describe them often made me appear to be complaining about minor social friction rather than dealing with systematic psychological warfare. David's position as the person caught between family loyalty and spousal support created additional emotional complexity that required careful navigation. I could see the stress that family tensions were creating for him, and I was determined not to force him to choose between relationships that were both important to his well-being. This meant finding ways to maintain my own emotional stability while supporting him through conflicts that were fundamentally about other people's inability to accept our marriage. The emotional discipline required to maintain this balance was exhausting, but ultimately strengthening. I learned to separate my sense of self-worth from external validation, to find satisfaction in my own achievements rather than depending on recognition from people who were psychologically incapable of providing it. I developed the ability to engage with hostile family members without internalizing their negativity or allowing their behavior to compromise my own standards of courtesy and respect. This internal work was supported by the continued success and growth of my business, which provided concrete validation of my capabilities and character that no amount of family disapproval could diminish. The platform we had built was transforming the financial circumstances of thousands of families, creating measurable positive impact that confirmed the value of the work I was doing and the principles that guided my approach to business and life. Third, user testimonials and success stories that arrived regularly provided emotional sustenance during the most difficult periods of family conflict. Reading about single mothers who had built college funds for their children, about working families who had achieved homeownership through our investment tools, about young people who had started businesses using capital accumulated through our platform, reminded me daily that my work was creating genuine value in the world, regardless of what David's family believed about my motivations. The professional recognition that continued to accumulate also provided external validation that helped counteract the psychological impact of family hostility. Industry awards, speaking invitations, media coverage, and board appointments represented acknowledgement from qualified professionals who understood the significance of what I was building and the character required to achieve it. These forms of recognition were based on objective assessment of actual accomplishments rather than subjective interpretations colored by personal prejudice or psychological investment in particular narratives. The contrast between professional respect and family hostility created an interesting psychological dynamic that ultimately strengthened my resolve and clarified my priorities. The people who knew me through my work consistently demonstrated appreciation for my capabilities and character, while the people who opposed me had never taken the time to understand what I was actually doing or why it mattered. The disconnect between these two assessments was so stark that it became impossible to take the family criticism seriously as legitimate feedback about my actual behavior or motivations. This clarity allowed me to develop a more strategic approach to family relationships that protected my emotional well-being while maintaining appropriate boundaries and expectations. I stopped trying to win acceptance from people who were psychologically committed to rejecting me, and instead focused on maintaining courteous but distant relationships that minimized opportunities for conflict while preserving David's ability to maintain family connections that were important to him. The strategic emotional distance I created had the unexpected effect of reducing the power that family hostility had to create stress or self-doubt. When I stopped needing Patricia's approval or acceptance, her criticism lost its ability to hurt or undermine my confidence. I could observe her behavior with the same objective curiosity I might apply to studying competitor strategies or market dynamics, recognizing patterns and motivations without taking them personally or allowing them to affect my self-perception. This emotional evolution coincided with a period of intensive business expansion that required my complete focus and attention. The regional growth strategy I had developed was entering its implementation phase, with location scouting, hiring, planning, and infrastructure development consuming enormous amounts of time and mental energy. The complexity and stakes of this expansion made family drama seem trivial by comparison, providing natural protection against psychological manipulation that might have been more effective during periods of less intense professional engagement. The expansion planning process also brought me into contact with economic development officials, local business leaders, and community organizations in Rust Belt regions where my company could potentially create significant employment opportunities. These conversations provided insight into the severity of economic challenges facing communities like the one where David's family lived, while also revealing the enthusiasm that local leaders felt for companies willing to invest in regions that had been largely abandoned by other growing businesses. The economic data I reviewed during this research was sobering and illuminating. Unemployment rates in many Ohio communities had reached levels not seen since the Great Depression, with manufacturing job losses creating ripple effects throughout local economies. Young people were leaving for opportunities in more prosperous regions, creating demographic challenges that threatened the long-term viability of entire communities. Local governments were struggling to maintain basic services while dealing with declining tax revenues and increasing social service demands. The human impact of these economic trends was visible in every community I visited for expansion research. Families were losing homes to foreclosure, small businesses were closing due to declining customer bases, and social problems were increasing as economic stress created additional pressure on already strained community resources. The challenges were systemic and substantial, requiring innovative solutions rather than traditional approaches that had become inadequate for addressing current economic realities. The irony of Patricia's characterization of me as a gold digger became increasingly apparent as I learned more about the economic circumstances affecting her community and family. The business I had built was specifically designed to address exactly the kind of financial challenges that working families throughout her region were experiencing, while the expansion I was planning would create exactly the kind of employment opportunities that her family members would need to maintain economic stability in an increasingly difficult environment. My company represented hope for economic development in communities that had been systematically neglected by other growing businesses. We offered good jobs for educated workers, contributed to local tax revenues, and provided services that helped working families build financial security despite challenging economic circumstances. The manipulative opportunist that Patricia had spent years denouncing was becoming positioned to provide exactly the kind of economic salvation that her community desperately needed. The psychological complexity of this situation required careful processing and strategic thinking about how to navigate potential future interactions between my business success and David's family's economic needs. I recognized that circumstances might eventually create opportunities for family members to seek employment with my company, and I wanted to be prepared to handle such situations with appropriate professionalism, regardless of the personal history that would complicate those interactions. The mental preparation for potential future encounters with family members in professional contexts involved developing clear boundaries between personal and business considerations. I committed to evaluating any family member who might seek employment based solely on their professional qualifications and potential contributions to company goals, without allowing personal relationship dynamics to influence business decisions either positively or negatively. This approach reflected my broader philosophy about maintaining integrity and professionalism regardless of external circumstances or interpersonal complications. I would not allow family hostility to compromise my business judgment, just as I had not allowed it to compromise my personal values or professional standards. The same principles that had guided my response to character assassination would guide my approach to any future professional interactions with people who had participated in that campaign. The internal fortress I had built through months of psychological discipline and emotional growth provided the foundation for whatever challenges lay ahead. I had developed the ability to maintain clarity about my own worth and motivations despite sustained external pressure to doubt both. I had learned to find validation in meaningful work rather than seeking approval from people who were incapable of providing it. Most importantly, I had discovered that excellence achieved through integrity was its own reward, regardless of whether that excellence was recognized or appreciated by everyone who witnessed it. The woman Patricia Hartwell had tried to break, through systematic psychological warfare, had emerged stronger, clearer, and more focused than ever before. The campaign against my character had failed to achieve its intended effect of creating doubt or limitation, and had instead created opportunities for growth and self-discovery that would serve me well in whatever circumstances lay ahead. The internal work was complete. The external validation would follow naturally as circumstances aligned to demonstrate the difference between someone who builds value through innovation and someone who seeks to destroy others through manipulation and psychological warfare. The 4th year of our marriage marked the beginning of a dramatic shift in circumstances that would ultimately reveal the true character of everyone involved in the sustained campaign against my reputation and worth. Economic pressures that had been building gradually in David's hometown began to accelerate into a full-scale crisis that affected every family and business in their community, while my company achieved breakthrough success that positioned us as one of the fastest-growing fintech firms in the nation. The contrast between these two trajectories created exactly the kind of ironic reversal that exposes the short-sightedness of judging others based on assumptions rather than evidence. William Hartwell's automotive parts manufacturing company reached its breaking point during the spring of that year, when 3 major customers simultaneously terminated their contracts in favor of overseas suppliers who could provide the same components at 60% lower cost. The loss of these accounts eliminated nearly 70% of his revenue overnight, creating an impossible financial situation that forced him to begin the process of closing operations and laying off employees who had worked for his company for decades. The impact of this business failure extended far beyond the immediate financial consequences for William and Patricia. Their company had been one of the larger employers in their community, providing jobs for 43 local residents whose paychecks supported families and contributed to the economic stability of numerous local businesses. The closure created a ripple effect of unemployment and reduced consumer spending that accelerated the economic decline that had been affecting their region for several years. Patricia's substitute teaching position was eliminated entirely during the same period, as budget cuts forced the school district to reduce staffing to absolute minimum levels and eliminate all part-time positions. Her income, which had never been substantial, disappeared completely at precisely the moment when household financial pressure was reaching its peak. The timing created a perfect storm of economic stress that threatened not just their lifestyle, but their ability to maintain basic financial obligations, including mortgage payments and healthcare expenses. David's siblings faced similarly challenging circumstances as the regional economic crisis deepened and employment opportunities became increasingly scarce. Jennifer had been working multiple part-time nursing positions to compensate for the lack of full-time opportunities, but hospital budget cuts eliminated several of these positions and reduced hours for others. Her income declined by more than 50% over a 6-month period, forcing her to consider relocating to find adequate employment despite her preference to remain near family. Michael's situation was even more precarious, as his sales position had been eliminated during company downsizing, and his subsequent job search had yielded only temporary assignments and commission-based opportunities that provided unpredictable income insufficient to support his family's basic needs. He had been unemployed for 8 months and was facing the possibility of losing his home if he could not secure stable employment within the next few months. The cumulative effect of these economic pressures created exactly the kind of financial desperation that my fintech platform had been designed to address, while also providing stark validation of the importance of building diversified income sources and investment portfolios that could provide stability during economic downturns. The families who were struggling most severely were those who had depended entirely on traditional employment and had never developed the financial literacy or investment strategies that could have protected them against regional economic decline. Meanwhile, my company was experiencing unprecedented growth and expansion that positioned us for national market leadership in democratizing access to financial services. Our platform had exceeded all projections for user acquisition, revenue generation, and customer satisfaction, while our comprehensive approach to serving working families had attracted attention from major institutional investors and strategic partners who recognized the commercial and social value of what we had built. The regional expansion strategy that I had been developing was entering its implementation phase, with detailed plans for establishing offices in 15 metropolitan areas across the Midwest and Southeast, where we could access talented workforces, while contributing to economic development in communities that needed new sources of employment and investment. The expansion would create more than 800 jobs over 18 months, with salaries and benefits that exceeded regional averages for comparable positions. The decision about specific locations for these new offices involved extensive analysis of factors including workforce availability, educational infrastructure, cost of living, transportation access, and local government support for business development. Ohio emerged as an attractive location for establishing a major regional hub that could serve multiple states while taking advantage of the skilled workers who were available due to manufacturing industry decline. The Cleveland metropolitan area met all of our criteria for operational efficiency, talent acquisition, and strategic positioning, while also offering the opportunity to contribute meaningfully to economic revitalization efforts that were desperately needed throughout the region. Local economic development officials were exceptionally responsive to our inquiries and offered incentive packages that made the financial case for Ohio expansion particularly compelling. The irony of potentially establishing a major office in the same region where David's family was experiencing severe economic distress was not lost on me, although I was careful to ensure that personal considerations did not influence business decisions that needed to be based solely on objective analysis of operational requirements and market opportunities. The proximity to David's family was coincidental rather than intentional, but it created the possibility that our expansion could provide employment opportunities for people who had spent years questioning my character and motivations. The announcement of our Ohio expansion plans generated significant media attention and enthusiastic response from local government officials, economic development organizations, and community leaders who recognized the potential impact of bringing hundreds of high-quality jobs to a region that had experienced devastating employment losses. The governor's office issued a statement praising our decision to invest in Ohio communities, while local newspapers featured articles about the economic development opportunities that our expansion represented. The scale and significance of this business success created cognitive dissonance for people who had been committed to Patricia's narrative about my character and motivations. The woman they had been told was a manipulative gold digger was creating exactly the kind of economic opportunities and community investment that their region desperately needed. The disconnect between their assumptions and observable reality became increasingly difficult to maintain as evidence of my legitimate business achievements accumulated. David began receiving phone calls from family members and community connections who had heard about our company's expansion plans and were curious about potential employment opportunities. These conversations were awkward and complex, as people who had previously expressed skepticism about my character were now seeking information about jobs that my success had created. The same relatives who had supported Patricia's campaign against me were suddenly interested in the financial benefits that association with my company might provide. The transformation in family dynamics was subtle but unmistakable. Conversations that had previously focused on concerns about my influence on David began to include questions about our business plans and hiring strategies. Family members who had avoided direct interaction with me started asking David to share information about job qualifications and application processes. The hostility that had characterized family relationships for years was gradually being replaced by recognition that their economic circumstances required them to reconsider their approach to our marriage and my professional achievements. Patricia's response to these changing circumstances revealed the depth of her psychological investment in her original narrative about my character. Rather than acknowledging the disconnect between her accusations and the reality of what I was building, she developed increasingly sophisticated rationalizations that allowed her to maintain her hostile perspective while recognizing the practical benefits of my business success. She began suggesting that my willingness to hire family members would be evidence of my calculated attempt to buy acceptance and legitimacy within their family. This psychological maneuvering demonstrated Patricia's fundamental inability to accept evidence that contradicted her predetermined assumptions about my motivations and character. She had become so invested in viewing me as a threat that she could not recognize or acknowledge clear evidence of my positive impact and genuine contribution to economic development. Her mental framework required maintaining me as an antagonist, regardless of how beneficial my actions might be for her family and community. The evolution of her narrative from direct accusation to sophisticated rationalization created additional stress for David as he navigated between family relationships and spousal support. He could see that his mother's hostility was becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. But he also understood that direct confrontation would not change her fundamental perspective. The situation required diplomatic management that acknowledged family relationships while protecting our marriage from continued interference. My approach to these changing dynamics was guided by the same principles that had sustained me through years of family hostility, maintaining absolute professionalism and integrity regardless of external circumstances or interpersonal complications. I would evaluate any family member who might seek employment based solely on their qualifications and potential contributions to company goals, without allowing personal relationship history to influence business decisions either positively or negatively. The hiring process for our Ohio expansion was rigorous and comprehensive, involving multiple interview rounds, skills assessments, reference checks, and cultural fit evaluations that ensured we selected candidates who could contribute effectively to our mission and maintain the high-performance standards that had driven our success. Family relationships would not provide advantages in this process, but they also would not create disadvantages if candidates met all other requirements. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.